When I was not even 25, I was invited to be in the wedding of one of my college friends. This was not an ordinary wedding, you need to understand. The bride and the groom were both just out of medical school and were in residency training to be cardiologists. The bride's father, who was the funder of this wedding, was also a cardiologist and was quite prominent in the town in northern New Jersey where they lived. All this was happening in Short Hills, New Jersey, which is a fairly wealthy part of New Jersey. For reference, it's where Richard Nixon lived for part of his retirement. So this was not going to be an ordinary wedding, and it turned out not to be an ordinary wedding in any way. Everyone who was invited was told to come in a tuxedo or an evening dress, whatever women wear when men wear tuxedos. All of the wedding party were in evening dress, white tie, and whatever women wear that's even fancier than an ordinary evening gown. There were 12 of us in the wedding party. It was an enormous wedding party. Then the florist had brought trees in tubs into the church and put lights in them, and had arranged 5-foot-tall flower arrangements on the tables in the reception so the guests wouldn't have to look around the flowers to see each other. We were told, the rumor went around, that the flower budget alone was between $25,000 and $30,000 for this wedding. As you would imagine, I remember less about the food, unfortunately, but the food and the drink and everything else was of similar magnificence. And when they finally got around to the dancing, the bride's parents got out and proved that they were competitive ballroom dancers before everybody else went out and did their thing. It was very memorable. What I didn't realize at the time, but do now, was that there were a lot of transactions going on in this wedding. I've done a couple of big society weddings as a priest. And so now I know that when you do one of these, what you're doing is you are paying forward and paying back your friends, your family, your coworkers, your professional colleagues, anybody else you may know. There's a lot going on in the way people are getting something and returning something to one another in the way that their children are married. You may know that in the Church of England, since early in its history, for many, many centuries, they were a little uncomfortable with the whole idea of how weddings work. And in fact, parts of Church of England weddings were traditionally held in the porch of the church rather than in the church proper, because they recognized something social was going on as much as something religious. Now, there may have been something similar going on with the wedding at Cana. We don't really see much of the front of the house, you'll notice. We hear hints. This must have been a fairly good-sized wedding if Jesus and his whole posse were invited to it. There must have been a lot of people. And we hear the steward going through the routine about when you serve the good wine and the bad wine. Plainly, the catering has been thought out in this case. But we never see the bride. We barely see the groom. We have no idea how many people were there or what they were doing, whether they had a good time. Most of the action that we see happens in the kitchen. We hear about mom and the servants. I think part of what we're being told about this story is that it's not really about transactions. That's a really strong message for you and for me as we go through our life of faith, as we go through our life of worship. How often do we come into this place imagining that we've come to get something from God or to exchange something with God, even worse? That as we go through our lives, the good deeds we do are somehow gaining us credit in heaven. We'll get paid back for it eventually. How often have you heard someone, hopefully not of this denomination, say, "No, your hard life here is what you'll get paid back for it in heaven." There is no transaction with God. There is nothing we can offer in return for what God has given us. We can't return God's hospitality. We can't even try. If that's all that you need to hear this morning, if that's enough to recognize that God is that gracious to us, despite the fact that we cannot return the favor, then meditate on that and be blessed. But I think there's more in this story that it's worth hearing, particularly now in the season of Epiphany. Epiphany, you'll know, is when we see new light, when we receive new wisdom, when we come to understand what it means to have God with us. I think there are hints hiding in plain sight in the story that we hear this morning. The first one requires us first to talk about mothers. I know my mother is watching right now, so I'm going to choose my words carefully. Mothers are not bossy. They don't give out orders. They don't tell people what to do. But mothers have a good understanding of how the universe is supposed to be organized. They know where everything belongs, and if it's not where it belongs, they're going to do something about it because it will bother them until it's fixed. My mother is this way. My mother has always been this way. Now at 94, she's still this way in her own special, sweet way. And I suspect that the Blessed Virgin Mary was also. She had a very unusual son who did very unusual things. I can only imagine that in her domestic life, she would have been trying to make sure that everything was well organized, whether for domestic peace and tranquility, or, to borrow a phrase, to prepare the way of the Lord. She would surely have been looking to see, well, what needs to be fixed here so that the plan of God can come fully into being. That's kind of what she does in this story. She knows Jesus pretty well. He knows her pretty well. She doesn't really have to spell it out. She goes to him and says, they're out of wine. It could just be an observation, but he knows that it's not. He gets a little cranky, but chances are she knows him well enough to know what he's going to do. So then she follows up by telling the servants, do whatever he tells you to, as if he's already made up his mind that he's going to do it. In this, we have an example of what it means to be an active follower of Jesus, what it means to be faithful, but also to take action. We can't always know exactly what God is going to do before we act, can we? Sometimes we get lucky, and we can say, the last 6 times we made this decision based on faith, it worked out well. So let's do it for a 7th time, because, why not? But there are other times when we'll have absolutely no past results as a basis to predict future outcomes. In those times, we have to step out in faith before we know exactly what God may decide to do. How often do we choose not to act because we can't quite be sure how it will turn out? Surely the mother of Jesus in this case couldn't know exactly what he would do, only that her faith told her that God would produce abundance in some way. How can we do any less? As it turns out, her faith seems to rub off onto other people because the servants then do their thing. Jesus says, we'll fill up the water jars, and they do. You ought to know that water is and always has been a pretty precious commodity. Just as an exercise, I tried this at 8 o'clock, we'll try it again here. Come up with a number in your head about how many gallons of water you think the average American uses every day. I had a number in my head before I went and looked it up this week. It was not the number that I came up with. Now you have that number. The average American uses 300 gallons a day. That's a whole lot of water. I can assure you, every day since then, I have been looking around my house thinking, where am I spending that much water? What am I using it for? Maybe I should use a little less, given that most of the world gets by on less than half that. And certainly, the servants at the wedding at Cana would have had to work pretty hard to get the water that they had on hand that Jesus was now telling them to pour into these big jars. 100 to 150 gallons of water. That's a lot of water. That was probably more than a day's worth of supply for them. It would have been a precious thing. Why would they not have saved it? To wash, to drink, to cook with, for everything else you would use water for. And yet, dear friends, wine is worth more than water. Water was only the raw material for this miracle, if you will. Without it, the miracle wouldn't have happened. For you and for me in this place, our raw materials are money, and property and human resources and creativity and energy, all of which are also precious, all of which are also limited, all of which we can think of better uses for. How tempting is it to hoard them, to hold on to them and say, well, some other bigger need is going to come up. When in reality, it's only once we offer those things, once we put them into play, that it's possible for them to be transformed. It's only if we're willing to fill the jars that the miracle can happen. How can we do any less than they did with the things that are precious to us, just as that was precious to them? And then the kicker comes at the end. Jesus did this, his first miracle, at a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and his disciples believed in him. It feels like the sentence is incomplete, as if it should end with, and they all lived happily ever after. But of course, we know they didn't. It's barely 5 verses later, and they're fighting with each other. They didn't believe him. They didn't believe each other. They fought with each other. They constantly fell away. They made mistakes. They didn't get the message right. It took them a long time to come to truly understand who Jesus was and what he was saying. This, dear friends, is the deepest and perhaps the most important message for you and for me. God with us is not an event, but rather a process. Just as is the case with a marriage. I mean, the ceremony and the party happen on one day, but the marriage develops over a lifetime. It's only by continuing to walk the way with Jesus that we truly discover what it means to have God with us, always and everywhere. So, we've had the party. We've at least made the beginning. Are we willing to risk a little? Are we willing to step out, risk what it is that we have, and see what God will make of it? Clearly, there are greater miracles to come. There are greater wonders to be revealed. We have only just begun. Let us take the next step. Amen.